All right, so we are continuing our winter break study series, Great Events of the Bible, and we're getting close to the end of that. Wednesday, I believe Bill Hodges is scheduled to lead our last class. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all those men who have led our studies this winter break. I appreciate that time spent together. This class today is going to be Hezekiah and Sennacherib from 2 Kings 18 and 19. If you want to go ahead and turn to 2 Kings chapter 17, we'll actually briefly read from that as our first section that we read. Many of the historical characters that we've been looking at might be called heroes of faith, but we want to remind ourselves that God is and always will be the hero of the story. And I think it's been evident in every person we've looked at that God is the one who is accomplishing His will, and sometimes working through those men, sometimes working despite those men. But God continues to be the hero of the story, and that's going to be abundantly evident in the story of Hezekiah. If it hasn't been obvious, it can't really be more obvious than it is in the case of Hezekiah. On Wednesday, Luke led us through a study in 1 Kings chapters 18 and 19, focused on Elijah during the time of King Ahab of Israel and of the northern kingdom. And Ahab lays claim to being one of the most wicked rulers of God's people. And so we're going to have a strong contrast there. During his reign, Ahab was in conflict with Assyria, who is also going to come into play in our discussion today. Ahab was part of a multi-king alliance during his time as king to actually fight against Assyria and the force that they were bringing about in the world and trying to exert their control. Then after King Ahab, there was a period where Assyria was, let's say, stagnant for about 100 years. They were still in existence, but they weren't really expanding and exerting their control as they had been. But then they got a new king, and they renewed their ambition to expand and control. And that really brings us to 2 Kings 17. So that kind of takes us from the time of Ahab to the time of Hezekiah in 2 Kings. So I'll go ahead and read verses in chapter 17, 2 Kings chapter 17, I'll read verses 5 and 6. Then the king of Assyria, and this is Shalmaneser is his name. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. And so here we see the historical account of the northern nation being carried away into captivity by the Assyrians. And in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5, God refers to Assyria as the rod of my anger. And so even in this, we see God in control, using Assyria as his instrument to bring about his judgment on the nation because of what they had done. So Israel is led away captive, and per Assyrian methods, they would take whoever they had taken captive and carry them away and relocate them in other areas, as the text we just read. And in the following verses that we won't read, it goes on to explain that why this had happened. This had happened because of the wickedness of the people, specifically because they had rejected God and his commandments, because they had followed false gods, they had built high places, and that they had performed adultery, even to the point of human sacrifice. And so other text talks about doing things that didn't even enter God's mind that they would do. And so then the end of the chapter explains that the other part of what this Assyrians, how they operated, was that they would take away the captives and relocate them other places. And then in that absence that they've filled, that void, they would take other peoples that they had captured and relocate them to that area. And so other peoples from other captured areas get moved into Samaria, and that explains why in the New Testament the Samaritans are so hated, because they are seen as people who don't belong there. They're people who have now intermarried, and they're seen as half-breeds, and they were really viewed as almost subhuman to the Israelites and their purity as the way they viewed themselves. And that brings us up to 2 Kings chapter 18, where we want to look today. So let's go ahead and turn to chapter 18, and I'll go ahead and read verses 1 through 8. It says, "Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. He also broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the sons of Israel burned incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord of God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. For he clung to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. And the Lord was with him. Wherever he went, he prospered. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. He defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city." So here we are introduced to King Hezekiah. Hezekiah can lay claim to being the best king of Judah. Josiah could also make a strong case. It's interesting, Hezekiah speaks about him clinging to Yahweh and keeping his commandments. And when it talks about Josiah later, it says that he turned to Yahweh with all his heart, soul, and might. So a little bit different emphasis on the two men and their characters. But again, I think that's why you could say that either one of those could probably lay claim to being the best king of Judah. But regardless, Hezekiah was a great reformer and great restorer. And if you read other texts, it goes on to detail all the things he did. But you see how he not only tore down the things that didn't belong, the high places and the idols and all those things, but he also built up and restored what did belong. And so even though it wouldn't take long for those things to go into corruption after his death, he did great work in following God and obeying his commandments, tearing down what didn't belong and restoring what did. And you see from the text we just read that God made him to prosper. He did well. And rebelled against the king of Assyria, and this was King Shalmaneser. All right. So then in verses 9 through 13, we won't read. It summarizes the carrying away of Israel into exile that we just read in chapter 17. And then that brings us to the introduction of King Sennacherib. So the kingdom has changed place in Assyria, and so Sennacherib is now the king. So let's go ahead and read verses 13 through 16 then. It says, "Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. So the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah gave him all the silver which was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorpost which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria." Now we'll pause just a moment to gain a little bit of perspective. Besides what we've read about Assyria, and briefly I spoke about Assyria, what do you know about Assyria from history? Specifically the way they interacted with people and their treatment of others. Yeah, John?
They were horribly
Okay, horribly abusive other captives. Any other? Vicious. Yeah. Terribly so. They were renowned, we'll say infamous instead of famous, for being brutal and cruel in their harsh treatment of their captors. They were known for disfiguring, dismembering, burning, really anything you could think of that man could imagine to be cruel to another person, they did it. And so this was well known by really the world at that time. This is the way the Assyrians acted. And the other part of this is probably a little bit difficult for us to relate to. We don't live in a world that has world empires. Okay? Assyria was the rising world empire and exerting their control. And we also live in what's described as a superpower. We're used to the United States. We have a great military. We don't have people coming into our borders and attacking us. But just try to imagine you're Hezekiah. You're the leader of the nation. And for us today, some other world superpower has come into Canada, all right? Canada represents Israel. And they've swept through and they've taken all the Canadians away. And they've relocated them and brought in other people into Canada. And they've treated them harshly, and we know how they've treated them. And now they haven't stopped there. They've come into our country. They've swept into our country, and they've taken cities along the way. They've gone from Detroit and then Philadelphia, and they're taking cities, and they're marching on our capital. So this is what Hezekiah was experiencing. He's seen his brother nation carried away into captivity, and now his own nation is being marched on by this brutal, huge force. And so that gives a little perspective on what we see Hezekiah doing here. But still, what are your thoughts on Hezekiah's response to what he sees happening? From the section we just read. Yes, John?
He apologizes, knowing now perhaps they're going to come into Judea and start to besiege Jerusalem, and the fact that he had stopped paying tribute to them. And of course, it talks about earlier somewhat about that because he rebelled. Mm-hmm. And so he apologizes to them and now starts paying.
Yeah.
He starts robbing the temple to do that, and
yeah.
as well as taking some of the gold off the doors and like that.
So John points out that there had been a time when Hezekiah was paying tribute to Assyria, and he had rebelled and was no longer doing that. And now that he sees Assyria at his doorstep, he's apologetic towards this enemy nation and offers to make payment. Yeah, John?
They weren't conquered yet, but they were like a client state. That's why they paid tribute.
Okay, yeah. So again, they weren't. They were still their own nation, but they were paying tribute to another nation who was stronger than them. Any other thoughts, John?
I think just carrying out this magnitude of what it was like for them. So we got this international power, this conquered Canada coming down, and all of Palestine, it just did very crudely, is about the size of Indiana.
Yeah.
You know, and then, you know, the majority of Indiana has already been conquered, and maybe I'm the king of something that's like maybe a few counties in central Indiana, and the world power that has been just annihilating people and all this stuff you mentioned is, you know, on my doorstep.
Yeah. So John gives us some perspective, if you didn't hear that the nation of Israel or the Palestinian area was about the size of Indiana. I've seen it overlaid with the map, and it matches up pretty well. And then you got this world empire who's coming in and just leveling everything around you. And that gives a pretty good perspective. Still, was Hezekiah supposed to pay tribute to Assyria? What do we think he should have done? And I won't even take hands at this time. Just that's something to think about, okay? Hezekiah wasn't perfect. Hezekiah was a good king, even a great king, but he wasn't a perfect king. And so just hold that thought a little bit, and as we progress, maybe that'll help fill out that thought just a little bit.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
You know, as I listen to this, I hear a little bit of panic. I think we're all
Like more than a little.
alluding to it, right?
Yeah.
We're alluding to it, but he's got people around him as his advisors, as his nobles, part of their family are in these conquered territories. You know, Jerusalem wasn't an island. They were a connected people, and so there would have been relatives who have now been taken away and treated harshly, disfigured, gone through all this torture. So, yeah, and there's just this, when you read this description of how righteous Hezekiah is, it almost like you can hear what's not said so loudly. There's no mention of seeking God. And in this calm, safe environment that I sit in, you know, I read the story Monday morning, you know, quarterback here, and looking back, and it's just like, well, why didn't he ask God about it? You know, but at the moment,
Yeah.
you do a lot of things when there's a sense of urgency and panic, and everything's going wrong.
Yeah. So Matt points out that we don't see a record here of Hezekiah seeking counsel from God or going to God, asking him what to do. He's acting even as we pointed out last time, sort of like Peter when he sees the wind and he sees the waves and he responds based on what he sees. Did you have another point, John?
I was just thinking, I'd forgotten that the army had already come into Judea, and they had already conquered some cities, and I think there were like 35 towns or cities that he had already conquered. He hadn't come to Jerusalem yet, but we see where he does.
Yeah, he's getting there. Yeah. All right. So the next thing that happens is the Assyrian king does send his it's described as his large army to Jerusalem along with spokesmen. And so he has spokesmen who are coming on his behalf to deliver his message to the people. And then Hezekiah sends out, or Hezekiah's people come out, his representatives, and they meet and have a discussion. So let's go ahead and read in chapter 18, verses 19 through 25, continuing the thought here. Then Rabshakeh, as I recall, that wasn't actually the guy's name, that was his title. He was the Rabshakeh. I'm not certain about that. Then Rabshakeh said to them, "Say now to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria," so this would be Sennacherib, "what is this confidence you have? You say, but they are only empty words, I have counsel and strength for war. Now on whom do you rely that you have rebelled against me? Now behold, you rely on the staff of this crushed reed, even on Egypt, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who rely on him. But if you say, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before the altar in Jerusalem? Now therefore come, make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses, if you are able on your part to set riders on them. How then can you repulse one official of the least of my master's servants, and rely on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Have I now come up without Yahweh's approval against this place to destroy it? Yahweh said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. So here we see the message, and there's not so subtle insults included in his message as he talks about Hezekiah and this nation. But he says one thing is you can't rely on Egypt. And if you remember history, Israel had a history of not being able to cut ties with Egypt, and they would actually go to Egypt to seek help when they were in trouble. And so the king of Assyria says you can't rely on Egypt. They're a weak reed. And you can't rely on Yahweh. I think it's interesting that they know the name of Israel's God. They use his given name, the name that God said to call him. And it's also interesting, I think, at the very end there, he says, Yahweh said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. So he's making claim to be working under the direct orders of Israel's God. And so he's essentially saying, there's no way that you can work against me, because no one else can, and I'm even working on direct orders of your God. And so this is the message that he delivers. And then we see that Hezekiah's representatives ask him not to speak in Hebrew, because they don't want the people to understand this message that's being brought. And his response is to speak louder and to yell in Hebrew so that everyone can understand. So he wants to make sure that the common people get the same message, that it doesn't get mistranslated between the officials and the common people. They're all going to hear it directly from his mouth, the message that he's delivering to them in their language. And so he kind of doubles down on the message. He says, don't be deceived by Hezekiah. He says, Hezekiah can't deliver you. Don't trust in Yahweh, again, using God's covenant name. He makes the point that no other gods have withstood Assyria, so your God is going to be no different. He can't withstand us. And he goes on to say, essentially, surrender and you'll be treated great. We'll give you good stuff. We'll give you a place to live. We'll give you good food. And so really makes a really good offer. And again, if you try to step back and think of their perspective, here you are in a city that's soon to be surrounded, and you got people saying, hey, if you just surrender, you're going to be treated great, as opposed to what you know has happened and what you see happening, and you feel like there's nothing you can do about it. It actually sounds like a pretty decent offer, maybe one you should think about, consider taking. All right. And so in chapter 19, or the end of chapter 18, I say, the representatives carry this word to Hezekiah. And so that brings us to chapter 19. So Hezekiah gets this message that had been relayed from the representatives of Sennacherib, and he tears his clothes, and he enters into the house of Yahweh. He sends for the prophet Isaiah and asked him to pray for the nation. So that's a good place to pause. What do you see here in Hezekiah's response compared to what we'd seen previously? John?
We put sackcloth on, which means he's grieving with what's going on.
He's grieving, yep.
And then he goes to the house of the Lord. So he turns to the Lord and goes there to pray to him. Now later on, I think it talks about where both Isaiah and Hezekiah both pray to the Lord. Or both pray.
Okay. Yeah, so go ahead, Andy.
I feel very, what I'm trying to say, I feel like I can understand Hezekiah, because he tried what was in his control, which was to appease the king of Assyria with gold, with money, what he could do.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe out of panic, maybe out of fear, maybe all these people in Assyria, he did it. Well, that didn't help. They're still right at the doorstep with threats. And now, there's nothing else to do. There's nothing he can do. And I often find myself in that exact situation, trying to juggle everything until I see it crashing down, and then I finally go to God.
Yeah. So Andy's suggesting that Hezekiah has done anything that's within his power, appeasement, payoff, sees that hasn't worked, and turns to God. And so we see him entering into God's house to go where the presence of God is, as well as calling on Isaiah, God's spokesman. And so both good choices to seek God and to seek God's spokesman who could be able to communicate and tell him what God thinks about this situation. So let's go ahead and read, let's see, verses 6 and 7 in chapter 19. So this is Isaiah speaking to, the servants of Hezekiah have come, and so now Isaiah said to them, thus you shall say, start over, thus you shall say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me, Behold, I will put a spirit in him so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. And so Isaiah and Hezekiah aren't together at this point. They're back and forth with messengers, and he says, relay this message to the king, King Hezekiah. So what do you see in this, what Isaiah has provided? What's that mean? Shoo!
I have hope in you. I have gone now to whom I should have gone.
Yeah. So Isaiah delivers this message of hope, John.
Yeah, he tells them it's okay, God's gonna take care of it. That idea of hope, but he also gives forth a prophecy that the king's gonna die in his own land by the hand of the sword. And later on, if you read in Second Chronicles chapter 32, I believe it is, it talks about his sons killing him in his temple when he went in there to pray.
Yeah. So these words of hope, these words of encouragement, and it's one thing to say, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, which can sound pretty empty, but when you back it up with, he's not going to do anything, and he's going to go back and he's going to die. Very specific prophecy from the one he knows is God's spokesman, and that just would have to be a real boost. Andy?
The other thing that I would have heard is that last part where he says, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed thee. It shows that God heard everything that was said, and it's not about Hezekiah, it's not even about Israel or Judah, it's about what they're claiming and saying about God. And that would put that confidence in me that God knows what's happening here, and it's not just what it looks like to the world around us.
Yeah. So that would take a little bit of critical thinking from the hearer to get that message. Wait a minute, God has heard because God has says that this enemy nation has blasphemed me, and that's why he's going to take care of business. Yeah.
I also feel that from my perspective, God is taking even more of the lead than we often see. Like often people are told, oh, go and do this thing, and then I'll be with you. But Hezekiah tried to do it his own way, and now he doesn't even seem like he's really involved.
Yeah.
Solutions.
Yeah, so we see Yahweh, the words Austin used, taking the lead to show what he is going to do. And I think it's also I think it's obvious, but it's also noteworthy. If you have headings in your Bible, I think mine said something like Isaiah encourages Hezekiah. This is God encouraging Hezekiah. Isaiah is just the messenger. This is not the words of Isaiah. This is the words of Yahweh. And so taking that lead. Natalie?
I have a question. The difference between how he takes over the other countries, as opposed to, maybe it's just because it's not documented, but the dialogue between the kings, there's none of that when they go to Samaria or, Israel, and how maybe this is a scenario where God is showing what he's going to do. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that difference between, I mean, they just go in and, yeah, I mean, obviously there's something to learn from just being here.
Yeah. So Natalie's pointing out that, at least to my knowledge, we don't have record of this interaction between the Assyrian king and the Sumerian king, or the Israel king. And did that not happen? Is just recorded for our benefit? And I don't know that I know the answer to that. From a practical standpoint, if you can get people to surrender without exerting the effort to actually build siege walls and all that stuff, then it just makes it easier to conquer them. Anybody else have a thought? Yeah, Steve.
Historically, we do see that it is mentioned by Moses and others that the nations will see you doing things. The nations have seen you lead us out of Egypt. And so, as time has passed, Yahweh is still known by the other nations, and there is some level of awareness and respect, and even he's even
All right. So, Sennacherib now gets an update from this Rabshakeh character, and he's not there, so he sends a message back to Hezekiah, not to be deceived. And this time he says, not to be deceived by his God. So Hezekiah, don't be deceived by your God. Jerusalem is going to fall just like all the others. And he makes a point of recounting all these other gods weren't able to protect these other peoples, and you're going to be no different. And so then we see in verses 14 through 19, go ahead and read that, the response of Hezekiah. So this was sent in a letter format. And I tried to look for a good image. I was going to do it, put it on a PowerPoint, and I didn't really find a good one, so use your best imagination what this looks like. Then Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And he went up to the house of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord, the God of Israel, who are enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Yahweh, and hear. Open your eyes, O Yahweh, and see, and listen to the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to reproach the living God. Truly, O Yahweh, the king of Assyria, have devastated the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. So they have destroyed them. Now, O Yahweh, our God, I pray, deliver us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Yahweh, are God. So what do you see in Hezekiah's response, in his approach to God? Humility. Great humility. Kevin?
I think we've said it, but it connects this with what we've been studying with Elijah on Mount Carmel, the Exodus out of Egypt. God's name is being challenged, being blasphemed. David and Goliath, again, he's taunting God, and the stakes are high. And Hezekiah recognizes it, and he's going, this is your name, we are your people, help. Show the world that you are who you are.
Yeah, Kevin's pointing out that emphasis on what really matters. What really matters is Yahweh's name is being blasphemed because of what these people are doing, and that can't happen. So calling on God to act so that won't happen. And so it's noteworthy. He starts with praise. Always a good example to start with praise when you're speaking to God. He asked God to hear the taunt of Sennacherib. I think he believes he knows God has heard it, but relaying that message. And then save us. Why? Because we deserve to be saved, or because we're a great people? No, because your name is being blasphemed. So do this so that your name will not be blasphemed. And that's critical. That's critical in his prayer. I think that should be critical in our prayers. Why do we want things to happen? We want things to happen so that God gets the praise, so God gets the glory, and so his name is not blasphemed. I think I saw two hands, Andy and John. We'll start with Andy.
One of the things I noticed as well that you see in a lot of the prayers, especially in the Old Testament, is that one of the first things he says is directly related to what he needs from God. So what is it about God that he's calling on God? Well, God is the King of God of Israel, and he is alone the King, the God of all the kingdoms of the earth. So that truth about who God is exactly what Hezekiah needs, because that's the challenge that Rabshakeh is putting out there. So it's interesting, you'll see in other prayers where they will call on God's mercy or some other aspect of who God is, because that's what's needed. And so it's directly connecting what is it about God that handles this situation.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think there's some benefit in us, me thinking through, why is it that I'm even asking him for help? What is it about God that tells me he's going to respond, he's going to hear me, he's going to be able to fix this?
Yeah. So linking the request to what I know about God. Yeah. John?
I just like the great reverence he shows. It reminds me of the Lord's Prayer starting out, where Jesus taught his disciples there, I think it's in Matthew 6, that model prayer where he starts out, Our Father. He shows him great adoration and reverence.
Yeah. So that reverence that he shows God and leads with that reverence. And so then we see that Isaiah, through Isaiah, we know that God tells Isaiah that he has heard his prayer. And what a comfort that would be to know that God has heard what I've just said. And then in verses 21 through 28 is really God's response. In verse 21, this is the word that Yahweh has spoken against him. She has despised you and mocked you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She has shaken her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. Whom have you reproached and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted up your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel. Through your message, you have reproached the Lord, and you have said with my many chariots, I came up to the heights of the mountains, to the remotest parts of Lebanon, and I cut down its tall cedars and its choice cypresses, and I entered its farthest lodging place and its thickest forest. I dug wells and drank foreign waters, and with the sole of my feet I dried up all the rivers of Egypt. Have you not heard? Long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass, that you should turn fortified cities into ruinous heaps. Therefore their inhabitants were short of strength. They were dismayed and put to shame. They were as the vegetation of the field and as the green herb. As grass on the housetops is scorched before it is grown up. But I know you're sitting down and you're going out and you're coming in and you're raging against me. Because of your raging against me and because of your arrogance has come to my ears, therefore I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back by the way which you came. So this is Yahweh's message to Assyria. He says, you have blasphemed the Holy One of Israel. My translation uses an exclamation point there, and I'm not sure if that really belongs or not, but it seems to fit. That they would dare to blaspheme the Holy One of Israel. He speaks of their arrogance, how they speak of all that they have done, and he makes it clear that anything that you have accomplished is because I have allowed it to be accomplished, because it's within my plan. From long ago, long before any of you were even born, I had a plan that this was going to come about. But you're going to be judged and you're going to be punished for what you have done. So just the way God works is absolutely amazing. He can take an enemy nation who is fierce and brutal and cruel, use them to exercise his judgment, but then not forget and bring them into judgment for what they have done. Do you have a thought, John?
It's interesting, in verse 28, he says he's going to do the same thing to the Assyrians as they have done to their captives, and putting the hooks in their nose and the bridles in their mouth, because that's how they took their captives back to Assyria.
Yeah. So turning their same actions back onto themselves, he is going to do to them what they have done to other captors. Starting in verse 32, it says, therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there, and he will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way he came, by the same way he will return, and he shall not come to this city, declares Yahweh. For I will defend this city to save it for my own name's sake and my servant David's name's sake. So again, the specificity that God gives about what's not going to happen, I always like the idea that they're not even going to shoot an arrow. If you imagine a city being surrounded, you know, Sennacherib does his own writing. He says he had Hezekiah caged like a bird. They were surrounded by a large army. And just some random soldier to just fire a shot into the city. It wouldn't maybe hurt anybody, but God says that's not going to happen. They're not even going to fire a single shot into the air, into the city. And they're going to go back, and I'm going to save this city for my own name's sake and my servant David's sake. And so we again invoke the name of David. Kind of briefly bring this to an end. So the words of Sennacherib, you know, he records what he had done. I had Hezekiah caged like a bird, but then that's sort of the end of the story with Sennacherib. He doesn't tell what happens next that we find in Scripture. You might say conspicuously missing the capture of Jerusalem because Jerusalem was never captured. So I guess just a thought question. I think some of the things you've been saying have sort of touched on this. If God was going to deliver Jerusalem, then why did we go through all this that we've just gone through? Why didn't he just, make Assyria hear of war somewhere along the way, and that would have been the end of it before they even got there? Yeah, Josh.
God has to remind us as human beings that we must depend on him and trust in him for all.
God needs to remind us, and what happens if we don't see it? Sometimes we don't get it. Andy, and then Austin.
It goes that sometimes to appreciate salvation, you got to know what you were saved from.
Yeah. To appreciate salvation, you got to know what you're saved from. There's a whole lesson right there. Yeah. Austin?
Well, sometimes I think it's easy to just think about Judah or Israel and that nation, but God is working for all the nations involved, so Assyria just as much. And in a similar way, there's times where Oliver, who's 3, I know what decisions he will make without influencing it. But just if I tell him not to touch something, I let him make the choice if he's going to obey or not so that he can then learn. And I believe that God does the same thing, where just because he knows what someone will do or is likely to do doesn't mean, or he still lets us do that before we face judgment or before we face safety.
Yeah, God knows what we're going to do, but we don't until we do it. Let me read the end of the story. Then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. It came about as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sarazar killed him with the sword. And they escaped into the hand of Ararat, and Asahadon, his son, became king in his place. And so that's why I said at the very beginning, if there was ever any doubt that God was in control, this leaves no doubt. 185,000, and not a single soldier had to lift a hand because God took care of it himself. And again, he is the hero. You have a thought, Matt, and we'll close with that.
So we see in his dealing with Israel, he used only as much pain as was necessary to get them to come to him with all their hearts. And he does the same thing for us. So the question is, how soon are we going to come to him? How much pain is it going to take for me to realize that I need him in this or that area of my life?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for your participation. And Lord willing, on Wednesday, we will conclude our winter study and look forward to that opportunity.